Every Halloween, the old Victorian house on the corner of Elm Street was the highlight of the night for the neighborhood kids. It stood tall and majestic, its windows glowing warmly, and a faint aroma of cinnamon and apples drifted through the air, drawing them closer. For years, it had been known as the best house to visit, with the kindest hosts who handed out the most generous portions of candy. It was as if the house itself came to life each Halloween, decked out in spooky decorations, with carved pumpkins lighting up the porch and cobwebs glistening in the moonlight. This year, things were no different. As dusk approached, a group of friends, Liam, Sarah, Emily, and Jake, gathered at the corner of the street, eagerly anticipating the annual trip to the house. They could see other kids already making their way up the path, laughing and chattering as they disappeared behind the wrought iron gate. The friends excitedly adjusted their costumes, ready for the night ahead. But as they took their first steps toward the house, something felt off. The air was colder than usual, and a strange silence had fallen over the street, as if all the sounds had been swallowed up by the shadows. They reached the house just as the last of the kids they had seen earlier entered. From a distance, it looked the same as always, but as they got closer, an unsettling chill crept up their spines. The jack-o'-lanterns flickered, their faces twisting into something almost sinister, and the once inviting porch now looked dark and unwelcoming. They hesitated at the gate, glancing at each other nervously, but curiosity won over fear, and they pushed it open with a creak that echoed down the empty street. When they stepped onto the porch, something strange happened. The house, which had been bustling with activity just moments ago, now appeared dark and lifeless. The lights were out, the decorations hung limp, and the smell of warm spices had been replaced by the musty scent of damp wood and decay. Emily knocked on the door, but there was no answer. She knocked again, louder this time. But the only response was the eerie sound of the wind rustling through the overgrown hedges. "Maybe they ran out of candy?" Jake suggested, though his voice was shaky. But they all knew that wasn't right. The owners never ran out of candy, not in all the years they had been visiting. Sarah pointed to the window, where she swore she could see shadows moving inside. "Look, someone's still in there," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The others turned to see, and for a moment they saw it too, a faint flicker of movement, like someone walking past the window. Liam, the bravest of the group, decided to try the door handle. To their surprise, it was unlocked and the door creaked open, revealing a dark hallway that stretched out before them. "Should we go in?" Emily asked, her hand gripping the edge of her witch's hat. "It feels wrong." But something compelled them forward, a mix of curiosity and the unspoken dare to face whatever was inside. They stepped into the house, their footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. The air inside was cold and stale, and the faint smell of rot made them cover their noses. As they moved deeper into the hallway, they realized the house was not just dark, but abandoned. The wallpaper was peeling, the furniture was covered in dust, and cobwebs hung from the ceiling like ghostly veils. It was as if no one had lived there for years. But that was impossible. They had just seen people walk in moments ago, leave. The word sent chills down their spines. But when they turned to run, the hallway was no longer there. Instead, they were faced with a wall, covered in the same decaying wallpaper as the room. Panic set in as they realized the house had changed, trapping them inside. They ran back to the door they had entered through, but it was gone, replaced by a solid wall of darkness. "What's happening?" Emily cried, tears streaming down her face. "We need to get out of here." Jake tried to comfort her, but even his voice was shaking. The whispers grew louder, surrounding them, overlapping in a chorus of eerie voices. "You shouldn't have come. You shouldn't have come." The friends huddled together, fear coursing through their veins, unsure of what to do. Suddenly, the front door burst open, flooding the hallway with light. They didn't waste a second, sprinting toward the exit. As they ran out, the cold air hit their faces, and they stumbled down the porch steps, gasping for breath. When they looked back, the house was no longer there. In its place stood an empty, overgrown lot, as if the house had never existed. The friends stared in disbelief, their hearts pounding, trying to make sense of what they had just experienced. The street was silent, no sign of the house or the children they had seen earlier. They wanted to believe it was a nightmare, but the chill that lingered on their skin told them otherwise. From that night on, the house on Elm Street was never seen again. But every Halloween, the kids in the neighborhood would whisper about the group who had disappeared for hours that night, returning with wide eyes and trembling hands, haunted by the memory of the disappearing house that almost kept them forever. It was Halloween night, and the streets of Willow Creek were alive with the sounds of laughter, the crunch of leaves underfoot, and the excited chatter of children. Houses were adorned with glowing jack-o'-lanterns, flickering candles, and cobwebs that gleamed in the moonlight. Among the groups of kids making their way from door to door collecting candy was a group of 4 friends: Max, Olivia, Ethan, and Mia. Dressed as a pirate, a ghost, a vampire, and a witch, they had been planning this night for weeks, determined to hit every house on their street before moving to the next block. As the evening wore on, their pillowcases grew heavier with candy, and their laughter echoed down the quiet, darkened streets. They made their way to the far end of the neighborhood, where the houses stood further apart and the streetlights barely reached, casting long, eerie shadows. "This is where the best candy is," Max said, adjusting his pirate hat. The others nodded in agreement, and together they approached an old Victorian-style house at the end of the road. It was the last house on the block, surrounded by tall, twisted trees that seemed to sway even though there was no wind. They climbed the steps to the porch, hesitating for a moment as they took in the dark, looming structure. It looked out of place, as if it had been plucked from a different era, with its chipped paint, darkened windows, and heavy wooden door. "Are you sure we should knock?" Mia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't see any decorations. Maybe they're not giving out candy." But Ethan, always the bold one, shrugged and rang the doorbell anyway. They waited, listening to the chime echo through the house. A few seconds passed, and just as they were about to turn away, the door creaked open. An old woman stood in the doorway, her face obscured by shadows. "Trick or treat," the kids said in unison, trying to sound cheerful despite the unease creeping up their spines. The woman said nothing but smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes, and dropped a handful of candy into each of their bags. She lingered for a moment, her gaze drifting from one face to another, before finally closing the door with a slow, deliberate creak. The friends walked back down the porch steps, their earlier excitement dimmed. "That was weird," Olivia said, glancing back at the house. "I don't like it." "Come on, it's just a creepy old lady," Ethan said, trying to sound brave. "Let's move on to the next block." But when they reached the sidewalk, they realized that Max was no longer with them. "Max," Mia called, looking around. "Where did he go?" Panic started to set in as they scanned the area, but there was no sign of their friend. "He was right behind us," Olivia said, her voice trembling. "He must be playing a trick on us." Ethan tried to reassure them, though he felt the same unease creeping into his chest. They called out for Max, their voices growing louder, but there was no reply. The street, once bustling with kids, was now eerily empty, and the chill in the air seemed to deepen. As they stood there wondering what to do, Olivia thought she saw movement out of the corner of her eye. A figure standing at the edge of the trees, just barely visible in the darkness. "Look," she whispered, pointing. The others turned and saw it too. It was a tall, shadowy figure standing perfectly still, watching them. The figure was draped in black, blending into the night, but there was something unnerving about the way it stood. Silent, unblinking, as if waiting. "Maybe that's Max," Ethan said, though even he didn't believe it. "He's trying to scare us." But as they took a few steps closer, the figure moved, swiftly, silently, disappearing behind the trees. "Max!" Mia shouted, but there was no answer. Instead, they heard a faint rustling, followed by footsteps crunching through the leaves, circling them. "We need to get out of here," Olivia said, her voice barely a whisper. "Something's not right." They turned and started to walk quickly, almost running. But no matter how fast they moved, the footsteps followed, always just a few steps behind. It was as if the figure was toying with them, letting them think they could escape. "We have to find Max," Mia said, her voice cracking with fear. "We can't just leave him." But the others didn't respond. They were too focused on the path ahead, trying to reach the brighter, busier streets. Suddenly, Ethan stopped, his eyes wide with terror. "Look," he said, pointing to the pavement. Scattered across the ground were pieces of candy, like a trail leading away from the road and into the woods. "That's Max's candy," Olivia said, recognizing the familiar wrappers. "He must have dropped it." They followed the trail, despite the knot of fear tightening in their stomachs, until it led them to a clearing deep in the woods. In the center of the clearing was a small abandoned shed, its wooden walls sagging with age, and the door hanging slightly open. They could hear faint whispers coming from inside, but the words were too soft to make out. "We have to go in," Ethan said, though his hands were shaking as he reached for the door handle. The others nodded, their faces pale, and together they pushed the door open. Inside, the shed was dark, but they could see the faint outline of a figure standing in the corner. "Max?" Mia whispered, her voice barely audible. The figure slowly turned, and for a moment they thought they saw their friend's face. But then the shadows shifted, and they realized it wasn't Max at all. It was the same dark, cloaked figure that had been following them. The figure took a step forward, and they could see its eyes, cold, hollow, and completely black. It smiled, a twisted, unnatural smile that made their skin crawl. The kids stumbled back, tripping over their own feet in their rush to get out of the shed. As they ran, they could hear laughter, soft, mocking, echoing through the trees. They didn't stop running until they were back on the main street, where the lights were bright and the sounds of Halloween had returned. Gasping for breath, they looked around, but there was no sign of the figure and no sign of Max. "What was that?" Olivia said, tears streaming down her face. "Where is he?" They never found Max. The police searched the neighborhood, the woods, and even questioned the old woman in the house at the end of the street, but there was no trace of him. The house, once alive with Halloween cheer, was found boarded up and abandoned, as if no one had lived there for years. And the friends, haunted by what they had seen, could never forget the way the dark figure had watched them, followed them, and then vanished, just like Max. Every year after that, when Halloween night rolled around, they would gather together, hoping that maybe somehow Max would return. But as the years went by, they knew the truth. Something had taken him that night, something that lurked in the shadows, waiting for the next child to follow the trail of candy into the dark. It was a crisp Halloween afternoon, and 10-year-old Benny was rummaging through the attic with his mom, searching for a costume to wear that night. They were late in preparing, and all the stores in town had been picked clean, leaving them with no choice but to search through old boxes. "Look, Benny," his mom said, pulling out a dusty old garment bag from a pile of forgotten holiday decorations. Inside was a vintage-looking pirate costume, complete with a tricorn hat, an eye patch, and a dark, tattered coat. "This was your uncle's costume when he was your age. You could wear this tonight." Benny hesitated, looking at the costume. It had a strange, musty smell, and the fabric felt unusually heavy in his hands. But with no other options, he shrugged and agreed. "Sure, I'll be a pirate," he said, though a part of him felt uneasy as he tried on the outfit. The hat was too big, and the coat hung loosely over his small frame, but his mom adjusted it until it fit just right. "There, you look perfect," she said with a smile, snapping a picture before they headed downstairs. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Benny and his friends gathered outside, ready to trick or treat. He felt a little more confident now, joining in their excitement as they ran from house to house, filling their bags with candy. But as the night went on, something strange began to happen. Benny, usually shy and quiet, started acting differently. He spoke louder, more brashly, and used old-fashioned phrases that his friends didn't understand. "Ar, mateys, give me all your loot," he shouted at a group of kids, laughing in a way that sounded almost menacing. His friends exchanged confused glances, unsure what to make of his sudden change in behavior. "Benny, are you okay?" asked his best friend Jake. But Benny just grinned, his eyes twinkling in the dim light. "Of course I'd be fine, you landlubber," he said, slapping Jake on the back with a force that made him stumble. Jake frowned, rubbing his shoulder. "Seriously, Benny, you're acting weird. Cut it out." But Benny ignored him, leading the group to the next house, his stride unusually confident, almost swaggering. As the night went on, Benny's behavior grew even stranger. He started to drift away from the group, wandering down dark, narrow streets they usually avoided. "Benny, wait up!" called one of the kids, but he didn't respond. It was as if he couldn't hear them, or worse, didn't care. We're supposed to stay together, Mia said, glancing nervously at the others. Maybe we should just head back. But no one wanted to abandon Benny, so they followed him, their footsteps echoing through the quiet streets. They eventually caught up to him, standing in front of an old abandoned house at the end of Willow Street. The house had been empty for years, with broken windows, peeling paint, and a yard overgrown with weeds. No one ever trick-or-treated there, and yet Benny was staring up at it, as if entranced. "Why are we here?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Let's go back. This place gives me the creeps." But Benny just turned to them, his face partially hidden under the brim of his tricorn hat, and said, "There's treasure inside. We're going in." The others hesitated, glancing at each other with wide eyes. "What treasure?" Mia asked, trying to sound brave. "There's nothing in there, Benny. Let's go home." But Benny's expression darkened, his eyes narrowing. "You cowards," he spat, his voice dripping with disdain. "If you won't join me, I'll find it myself." Without waiting for a response, he pushed open the creaky gate and started walking towards the house, his movements stiff and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. "Wait!" Jake shouted, running after him. The others reluctantly followed, their footsteps hesitant and slow. The front door was already open, hanging on its hinges, and they could see Benny disappearing into the shadows inside. The house was dark, the air thick with dust and the faint, stale smell of something long forgotten. "Benny, this isn't funny anymore," Mia said, her voice shaky. "Come on, let's just go." But Benny ignored her, moving deeper into the house. The kids could hear him mumbling under his breath, though the words were hard to make out. It was as if he was talking to someone they couldn't see, someone hidden in the dark corners of the room. "Who are ye?" he muttered, his voice echoing eerily. "Show yourself, you scurvy dog." Suddenly Benny's head snapped up and he turned to face his friends. His eyes looked different now, darker, emptier, as if the Benny they knew was no longer there. "What's going on?" Jake whispered, backing away. But before they could react, Benny lunged at them, grabbing Jake's arm with a grip that felt ice cold. "You'll never find the treasure," he hissed, his voice low and menacing. "Not without me." Panic surged through the group, and they pulled Jake free, dragging him toward the door. But as they did, Benny's coat caught on something, tearing a small piece of fabric. For a moment, they saw the skin beneath, a pale, sickly white, as if he hadn't seen the sun in years. "We have to get out of here!" Mia screamed, and they bolted for the door, leaving Benny behind. They didn't stop running until they were far down the street, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. "What happened to him?" asked one of the kids, eyes wide with terror. "I don't know," Jake said, trembling, "but that wasn't Benny, not anymore." They looked back at the house, expecting to see their friend standing in the doorway, but there was no sign of him. The house was dark, silent, as if it had swallowed him whole. The police searched the house and the surrounding area, but there was no trace of Benny. The costume was found lying on the floor, neatly folded, as if it had been carefully placed there by unseen hands. When they asked Benny's mother about it, she was puzzled. "That costume," she said, shaking her head, "it wasn't supposed to be in the attic. We donated it years ago after my brother, well, he went missing one Halloween when he was a boy. He was wearing that same pirate costume." The story spread quickly, and soon everyone in town knew about the haunted costume that seemed to take over anyone who wore it. The kids would never forget the look in Benny's eyes, the way his voice had changed, and the feeling that something ancient and dark had taken hold of him, using him like a puppet. And every Halloween, when the moon was high and the wind whispered through the trees, they could still hear the faint echo of a pirate's voice, calling out from the shadows, searching for treasure that was never meant to be found. It was a chilly Halloween night in the quiet suburb of Willowbrook, and a group of kids, dressed in their best costumes, roamed the neighborhood, bags in hand, ready to collect as much candy as they could. Among them were Emma, Josh, Lucy, and Tyler, all excited to fill their bags with sweet treats. The streets were decorated with glowing jack-o'-lanterns, cobwebs, and fake skeletons, and cheerful laughter echoed as children ran from house to house. As they approached the end of Maple Street, they noticed a house that stood out from the rest. Unlike the other homes, It had no Halloween decorations, no lights on the porch, and no sign of anyone living there. The house was old with peeling paint, and the yard was overgrown, as if it hadn't been tended to in years. "Let's skip this one," said Lucy, nervously glancing at the dark, unwelcoming house. "It looks creepy." But Tyler, always the daredevil, grinned and said, "Come on, guys. Maybe they have the best candy. No one else is brave enough to knock." He marched up the steps, his friends reluctantly following behind. Emma hesitated at the bottom of the steps, her stomach twisting with unease. "I don't know, Tyler. It doesn't look like anyone lives here." But Tyler just laughed, raising his fist to knock on the heavy wooden door. Only one way to find out. He knocked 3 times, and for a moment there was nothing but silence. The kids exchanged nervous glances, ready to turn back, when suddenly the door creaked open, revealing a dark hallway inside. No one was there to greet them, but a small bowl of candy sat on a table just inside the doorway, as if it had been left there for trick-or-treaters. "See? I told you there was candy," Tyler said, reaching for the bowl. Emma's eyes widened. "Wait, Tyler? What if we're not supposed to take it?" But Tyler ignored her, grabbing a handful of candy and dropping it into his bag. "Whoever lives here must have put it out," he said, shrugging. "No harm done." The others hesitated for a moment before taking some candy too, though they couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. They quickly left the porch, glad to be away from the eerie, dark house, and continued down the street, trying to forget about it. As the night went on, they visited house after house, their bags growing heavier with sweets. But as they laughed and joked, they couldn't help but feel like they were being watched. Emma kept glancing over her shoulder, convinced she saw a shadow moving just out of sight. But every time she turned around, there was nothing there. "You guys feel that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Like we're not alone?" Josh nodded, shivering despite his thick costume. "Yeah, it's weird. I thought I saw someone behind us a few times, but there's no one there." The group huddled closer together, their excitement fading into unease. They decided to call it a night and head home. But as they turned to leave, they heard footsteps behind them, slow and deliberate, echoing through the quiet street. "Who's there?" Tyler shouted, trying to sound brave, but his voice cracked with fear. No one answered, but the footsteps grew louder, closer. Emma's heart pounded as she spun around, but all she could see was the dark, empty street. "Let's get out of here," she whispered, and they started to walk faster, almost running now. But as they did, the footsteps quickened, following them, matching their pace. Suddenly, a chilling voice drifted through the night, soft but clear. "Trick or treat." The kids stopped, frozen with fear, and turned to see a figure standing in the shadows. It was a man, dressed in a black old-fashioned suit with a pale, ghostly face. His eyes were dark, sunken, and he held out a hand, beckoning them closer. "You forgot your candy," he said, his lips curling into a twisted smile. "Come back and take it." Terrified, the kids turned and ran, sprinting down the street without looking back. They didn't stop until they were far from Maple Street, panting and out of breath. "What was that?" Lucy gasped, her face pale. "Who was he?" No one had an answer, but they all agreed to avoid the house and never speak of it again. They made their way home, desperate to forget the strange, unsettling encounter. The next day at school, they shared their story, but most of their classmates didn't believe them. "It's just a Halloween prank," one of the kids said, laughing. "Someone probably dressed up to scare you." But Emma couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than just a prank. She decided to do some digging, asking her parents and neighbors if they knew anything about the house on Maple Street. What she found sent chills down her spine. The house had been abandoned for years, ever since the old man who lived there passed away. His name was Mr. Harold, and he had died on Halloween night, alone in his home. He was known to be a recluse, never speaking to his neighbors, and no one had seen him for days until they found his body. Since then, no one had moved in, and the house had fallen into disrepair. Emma told her friends what she had learned, and they listened in stunned silence. "But that doesn't make sense," Josh said, his voice shaking. "We saw someone there. We heard him." Tyler's face was pale as he pulled the candy out of his bag, dumping it onto the table. "Look," he said, his hands trembling. "The wrappers. They're all old, like really old." The others looked closer and their hearts sank. The candy was covered in faded, dusty wrappers, the kind that hadn't been sold in decades. Emma's mind raced as she remembered the man's words. "You forgot your candy." But it wasn't their candy, it was his. The same candy he had given out years ago, before he died. They had taken it, and now he had come back to make sure they paid for it. That night, the kids gathered at Emma's house, too scared to be alone. They sat in silence, trying to make sense of what had happened. When they heard a knock at the door, they froze, their eyes wide with fear. "Who could that be?" whispered Lucy. Emma's mom went to answer, but before she could open it, a voice echoed through the house, cold and distant. "Trick or treat!" The kids screamed, dropping their bags and running to the back of the house, desperate to get away from the door. But the voice followed them, drifting through the hallways, growing louder, angrier. "You took my candy," it hissed. "Now I'll take you." They huddled together, terrified, until the voice finally faded, leaving behind an eerie silence. The next morning, the candy was gone, along with the old dusty wrappers. The kids never spoke of it again, but they never forgot the lesson they learned that Halloween night. Some things are better left alone, and some candy is not worth the cost. And every year, when Halloween rolls around, they avoid Maple Street because they know the house is still there, waiting, with a bowl of candy inside and a dark, silent figure watching, ready to welcome the next trick-or-treater who dares to knock. It was Halloween night, and the streets were alive with the laughter of children, the rustling of costumes, and the soft glow of jack-o'-lanterns. Among the trick-or-treaters were 4 friends, Liam, Ava, Ethan, and Mia, who were determined to make the most of the night. They had planned their route carefully, aiming to hit all the best houses and gather as much candy as they could before heading home. As they moved from house to house, their bags grew heavier, and their spirits were high. They were almost at the end of Willow Street when they spotted something strange. Standing under a flickering streetlight, just a few houses down, was a clown. Its bright, mismatched costume was garish under the dim light, with a red wig, white face paint, and a wide painted grin that seemed to stretch unnaturally across its face. The clown held a handful of balloons, each bobbing gently in the cool night breeze. The friends exchanged uneasy glances. "Creepy," Mia whispered, clutching her candy bag tightly. "Why is he just standing there?" Liam shrugged, trying to act unfazed. "Probably just some guy trying to scare kids. It's Halloween after all." Ava laughed nervously. "Yeah, but he looks like he's staring right at us." Ethan squinted, and sure enough, the clown's eyes seemed to be fixed directly on them, unblinking and eerily still. "Let's just keep moving," Ethan said, trying to sound confident. "If we ignore him, he'll probably move on." But as they continued down the street, the clown didn't move. It simply watched them, its grin unwavering. They walked a few more houses, and when they dared to glance back, the clown was still there, standing under the street light, staring. "Okay, this is getting weird," Ava muttered. "Maybe we should just turn around and head back the other way." The group agreed, quickly crossing the street and doubling back. They continued down a different block, trying to laugh off the unsettling encounter, but no one could shake the feeling that something was wrong. As they turned onto Maple Lane, Ethan gasped and pointed. "Guys, look!" They all froze. The clown was there, standing at the end of the street, in the exact same pose, holding the same balloons with the same eerie smile. "How did he—" Mia stammered, her voice trembling. "He was behind us just a minute ago." "Maybe he took a shortcut," Liam said, but even he didn't believe it. The way the clown stood, perfectly still, with that wide, unnatural grin, made his skin crawl. "Let's go," Ava said, her voice urgent. "Just keep walking and don't look at him." They picked up their pace, walking quickly down the street, trying to put as much distance between themselves and the clown as possible. But every time they glanced back, he was there, following them from a distance. They could see the bobbing of the balloons, the bright colors of his costume, and those dark, unblinking eyes watching their every move. By now, the streets were starting to empty, and the once festive atmosphere felt heavy and oppressive. "Maybe we should just go home," Mia suggested, her voice shaking. "This isn't fun anymore." The others nodded, and they turned toward the direction of their neighborhood, hoping to lose the clown. But as they rounded the corner, there he was again, standing right in their path. Only this time, he was closer. "Okay, that's it," Liam said, his voice rising with panic. "I'm calling my dad. We need a ride out of here." He fumbled with his phone, but when he looked up, the clown was suddenly gone. They all stood there, wide-eyed and silent, trying to make sense of it. "Where did he go?" Ethan whispered. "He was right there." A rustling sound came from behind them, and they spun around to see the clown, now standing just a few feet away, close enough that they could see the cracks in his white face paint. The red paint smeared into a grotesque smile. His eyes, dark and hollow, were fixed on them, and he raised one of the balloons, tilting his head slowly to the side. "Run!" Ava screamed, and the group broke into a sprint, their hearts pounding as they raced down the street. They didn't stop to look back, but they could hear the sound of footsteps behind them, fast and heavy, echoing off the pavement. Liam glanced over his shoulder and saw the clown running after them, his balloons trailing behind, his painted grin still intact, as if frozen on his face. They ran down alleys, cut through backyards, and zigzagged through the neighborhood. But no matter how far they went, the clown was always there, somehow appearing ahead of them, waiting, watching. Panic gripped them as they realized they couldn't escape him. "This can't be happening," Mia cried. "How is he everywhere?" They finally reached the park at the edge of town, collapsing onto the grass, gasping for breath. "Maybe we lost him," Ethan said, though he didn't sound convinced. But as they caught their breath, they noticed something floating toward them from the darkness, one of the clown's balloons. It bobbed closer, drifting eerily until it was right in front of them. Then, from the shadows, the clown emerged. His painted smile stretched wider, almost splitting his face. He was closer than ever, his footsteps slow, deliberate, as he approached them. The friends scrambled to their feet, backing away, but the clown just kept coming, his eyes locked onto theirs, unblinking, unrelenting. "Please just leave us alone," Liam shouted, his voice cracking. But the clown said nothing. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a piece of paper, unfolding it slowly. He held it out for them to see, and in the dim light, they could make out a handwritten note. "Don't you want your candy?" With a sudden jerky motion, the clown threw the balloons into the air, and they burst, releasing a shower of glittering confetti. The friends screamed, stumbling backward, but when they looked up again, the clown was gone. There was nothing but the empty street, silent and still, as if the clown had never been there at all. They didn't wait around to see if he would come back. They ran all the way home, not stopping until they were safe inside, locking the doors behind them. The rest of the night passed in a blur, and when the morning light finally broke, they tried to convince themselves that it was all just a bad dream. But the next day, as they gathered to talk about what had happened, Ethan pulled out his candy bag, his hands shaking. "Look," he said, dumping the contents onto the table. Amidst the chocolates and sweets was a single red balloon tied to a small card. The card read, "See you next Halloween." The friends stared at the balloon, their faces pale, and for a long time no one said a word. They knew what it meant. The clown was still out there, waiting, watching, and when Halloween came around again, he would be back. It was the week before Halloween, and the air was thick with the crisp scent of autumn. The neighborhood kids were buzzing with excitement, planning their costumes and daring each other to trick-or-treat at the scariest houses. But no one could have anticipated the strange sight that appeared on Elmwood Avenue. It was Ethan who first noticed it. Riding his bike down the street one afternoon, he stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes widening. There, nestled between two familiar houses, was a new one. It was old and decrepit, with dark peeling paint and windows that seemed to stare back at him, like eyes in the skull of a long-forgotten monster. The thing was, Ethan was sure it hadn't been there the day before. He pedaled furiously back to his friends, Mia, Jacob, and Lucy, bursting into their usual hangout spot at the park. "You guys have to see this," he said, panting. "There's a house on Elmwood that wasn't there yesterday." Mia raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean wasn't there? People don't just build houses overnight." Ethan shook his head, his expression serious. "I mean exactly that. It just appeared out of nowhere. I've lived on Elmwood my whole life, and I've never seen it before. Intrigued, the group decided to check it out. As they approached the house, a shiver ran down their spines. There was something unsettling about it, something off. The paint was chipped, the shutters were hanging crookedly, and the lawn was overgrown with weeds, even though the rest of the street was neat and well kept. But the strangest part was the mailbox at the end of the driveway. It was old and rusted, yet it had a shiny new plaque with the number 1313 engraved in gold. "I don't like this," Jacob muttered, clutching his candy bag tightly. "Maybe we should just go home." But curiosity got the better of them, and they crept closer, their footsteps echoing off the cracked pavement. As they reached the front porch, the heavy wooden door creaked open, slowly and deliberately, as if someone, or something, was inviting them in. They hesitated, staring into the dark, yawning mouth of the house. "Maybe it's a haunted house attraction or something," Lucy suggested, trying to keep her voice steady, "like for Halloween," but deep down they all knew it wasn't. There were no signs, no decorations, no sense of fun. The house was cold and silent, and as they peered inside, the shadows seemed to stretch out, beckoning them closer. Against their better judgment, they stepped over the threshold, and the door slammed shut behind them with a deafening bang. "What was that?" Mia gasped, her heart racing. "Why did it close by itself?" Ethan reached for the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. "We're locked in," he said, his voice barely a whisper. The hallway was long and dark, with flickering light bulbs hanging from the ceiling. Faintly they could hear the sound of music, an old scratchy tune, like something from an ancient record player, echoing through the empty house. "This is a bad idea," Jacob said, but no one had the courage to argue. They followed the music, creeping down the hall until they reached a room filled with old furniture covered in dusty sheets. In the center of the room was an ornate gramophone, spinning slowly, playing a waltz that seemed out of place, eerie in the stillness. The kids exchanged nervous glances, but before they could decide what to do next, the music stopped, and the room was plunged into silence. Suddenly, a voice crackled to life, scratchy and faint, as if coming from an old radio. "Welcome, children," it said, and they jumped, looking around frantically for the source. "We've been expecting you." "Who's there?" Mia called out, her voice trembling. "Show yourself." But there was no reply, just the soft hiss of static. Then, one by one, the lights began to flicker and dim, until the room was bathed in an eerie, pulsing glow. Out of the corner of their eyes, they saw movement, shadows darting along the walls, slipping in and out of the dark corners of the room. Lucy clutched Ethan's arm, her hand shaking. "I think we should leave," she whispered, but Ethan shook his head, his face pale. "The door's locked, remember? We're stuck here." The air grew colder and the shadows began to coalesce, forming shapes, twisted, distorted figures that seemed to glide toward them, their faces shrouded in darkness. "Run!" Jacob shouted, and the group bolted down the hallway, desperate to find a way out. But the house was different now. The hallway stretched on endlessly, twisting and turning, leading them deeper into the maze-like interior. Doors appeared where there had been none before, and each one they opened led to another room, identical to the last, as if the house was playing tricks on them. Panting and terrified, they finally burst into a large room at the end of the hall, only to find it filled with mirrors. The reflections stared back at them, distorted and warped, their eyes wide with fear. "What is this place?" Mia said, her voice barely a whisper. "Why is this happening?" From somewhere behind the mirrors, the voice returned, clearer now, mocking. "You shouldn't have come here," it said. "Now you belong to the house." The mirrors began to ripple, and their reflections shifted, showing not the frightened kids but scenes of people, different people, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, wandering through the same house, their faces frozen in horror. The images flickered and changed, like an old film reel, showing more people, families, friends, all trapped within the walls of the house, lost in time. "We have to get out of here," Ethan said, his voice shaking, "before we end up like them." Frantically, they searched for an exit, but every door led them back to the same room, the mirrors surrounding them, mocking their desperation. It was as if the house was alive, bending and twisting to keep them inside. Just when it seemed all hope was lost, Lucy spotted a small, dusty window in the corner, slightly ajar. "There!" she cried. "We can crawl out!" They scrambled toward it, pushing it open, and one by one they climbed through, tumbling out onto the cold, wet grass outside. They looked back at the house, expecting to see it looming over them, but it was gone. The empty lot was there, just like it had always been, as if the house had never existed. The kids ran home, their hearts still pounding, unable to shake the feeling that they were being watched. The next morning they returned to Elmwood Avenue, but there was nothing there. No house, no sign of anything unusual. It was as if the house had disappeared without a trace. But every Halloween after that, they avoided Elmwood Avenue. They never spoke about the house again, but they all remembered. They remembered the shadows, the voice, and the feeling that something had been watching them, waiting. And sometimes, late at night, they could still hear the faint, scratchy sound of that old, haunting waltz echoing through the darkness, calling them back to the house that shouldn't be there. Thank you for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe.